I'm Ed Steinfeld, Director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Welcome to today's special Watson webinar, Federal COVID Response and Recovery Efforts, a conversation with U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Our special guest, of course, is Sheldon Whitehouse, who represents the citizens of Rhode Island in the U.S. Senate. Senator Whitehouse has been an outspoken voice on pandemic response and recovery efforts, particularly with respect to issues he's long advocated for nationally: economic resiliency, healthcare equity and access, and environmental protection, among others. Interviewing Senator Whitehouse in today's webinar will be my friend and colleague, Wendy Schiller, Chair of Brown's Political Science Department and Professor of Political Science and International and Public Affairs. Wendy, as many of you know, is a renowned expert on the U.S. Congress. Today's webinar will work in the following manner. Professor Schiller will interview Senator Whitehouse for 25 minutes or so. And then Professor Schiller and the Senator will take questions from you all in the audience. For those of you joining us via Zoom, please write your questions in the Q&A window, and you can start writing those questions now. Keep the questions coming. And for those of you joining us via YouTube Live, you can also write your questions in the comments section, and those questions will get to us. Again, please start bringing the questions in now. Wendy, let me turn it over to you and Senator Whitehouse. Thank you.
All right, well, I want to say thank you to Director Steinfeld and Senator Whitehouse. It's a great pleasure to be part of this event today. So, Senator Whitehouse, there's so much information out there on COVID-19, and the average voter, the average person is trying to sift through it all. If you could give them 3 things to know about COVID-19, about how life will be or how life is now or what the prospects are, what would those 3 things be moving forward?
First, it ain't over. So be vigilant about your personal health safeguarding, wear the mask, practice social distancing, avoid unnecessary public engagements. This is a long way from over, and although Rhode Island is doing better than most states right now, a lot of summer traffic comes through Rhode Island, and it's going to come from states that are having very, very strong resurgences of the disease, and that may have to go back into much more rigorous shutdown and protocol modes. So it ain't over would be number 1. Number 2 is safety is the path to economic recovery. Otherwise, we're just going to keep having to go back into shutdown mode. So there's not a dichotomy between safety and economic recovery. Safety is the path to economic recovery. And in fact, we're seeing it right in Rhode Island right now, because we're being able to reopen because we've been successful with our safety. And the third thing is, this is going to be around for a while. Even with a good vaccine, it'll take a while to get that distributed and out so that we can put this behind us. But it's going to be a while. So people need to be prepared to adapt where they can to the new world of a lot more remote activity, whether you're remote learning in school, remotely attending college, at college, but remotely attending classes while you're in college, remotely commuting to work, or even having to find something different to do because what you used to do isn't there any longer.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about small businesses and the Paycheck Protection Act and the federal response on that. How pleased are you or dissatisfied are you with the effectiveness of that program in its first iteration? And are you thinking maybe it'll be...
I'm pretty pleased with it. I think it worked really well. I mean, Rhode Island got nearly, I think we're at about $1.9 billion into Rhode Island small businesses through the Payment Protection Plan, and another maybe 350 million into Rhode Island through the Emergency Disaster Loan Program. So that's a lot of money in a state our size to dump, what, $2.3 billion into our economy. And it really kept the Rhode Island economy on life support while we had to essentially go offline economically to protect against the COVID pandemic. And now as we're coming back on, there'll be a lot more natural economic activity, but I really think we had to do it. It's worked out quite well. The expansion that was agreed to virtually unanimously in the House and the Senate has also been very helpful, making it more useful and more flexible of a program. So I think it's, considering how little time we had to prepare this, I think it's worked out phenomenally well.
And what are your thoughts about the unemployment subsidy and sort of the prospects for that? It ends in the end of July, that extra $600 a week. So where do you see Congress going with that, for the fall?
Yeah, well, the House bill extends the $600. There's some pressure back from the business community because they're having trouble hiring people back if they're in a situation which, by staying on unemployment insurance with the added 600, they end up with a bigger income than they would by returning to work. And a lot of employers don't want to be the one who call the unemployment office on their own employee to get them cut off so that they're forced back to work. So they're looking for a broader solution, which is to do something with that benefit so it's not such a disincentive. And there are a lot of ideas floating around. I mean, among other things, you could simply continue to pay the $600 for the period that it's already scheduled for people who did lose their jobs, even though they go back to work. So it's sort of like a bonus for having gone through the agony of temporarily losing your job. And now that you're going back to work, it's much more income security and obviously a big surge of money into the economy provides a general boost. And I'm keenly aware that for every business who says, oh my God, I can't get my workers back because of this, there's another business that because of that, somebody's coming in and buying a dishwasher, or somebody's making the rent check so that they don't have to be evicted. And so it's a mixed blessing, but I think with a little bit of tailoring, we'll be able to find a way to continue it. We're working on that now.
I think that's going to be really, really important to obviously millions of people, but particularly for Rhode Islanders. Now, COVID-19 has hurt the elderly and members of underrepresented groups very hard. You've introduced legislation, particularly to address nursing home care and also to promote telehealth. And in general, how do you see those kinds of changes in terms of nursing home and telehealth for particular communities that are disproportionately affected going forward? How do you think it's going to change because of COVID-19?
Well, let's start with the happy story, which is telehealth. We've been trying to expand telemedicine, telehealth for years now. And there's always been so much anxiety about, oh, is this going to raise insurance rates? Is this going to raise insurance costs? How is this all going to work out? Well, faced with a plague, we solved the problem very, very quickly. And the experience has been very good. In particular, the experience in the mental health sector and in the addiction recovery world has been extremely good because there's more attendance, there's more compliance, it's much more convenient, all of the things that benefit the patient. But what the providers are finding is that they're actually getting better candor and better engagement by people from the security of their own home without having to drive in, go to an office, sit in a waiting room, fill out a form. All of that appears to be not conducive to the kind of candor and open conversation that makes the provider relationship successful. So I think we are over the bridge on telehealth and there's no going back, and that's greatly to our collective benefit. Rhode Island has the oldest population in the country, and we have a lot of people in nursing homes, and the fact that so many of our fatalities were in nursing homes made that a really potent area for attention. And what we found is that while most nursing homes did a pretty good job, there really isn't a lot of support there. It's not a high-paying set of jobs working on the floors of these nursing homes. And so keeping people has been hard. The exposure of these employees and asking them to go into COVID environments has been hard. And there have been a couple of near misses where it looked like the COVID spread in the institution might be so great that people literally wouldn't come in any longer. And then where do you go? Who do you call to come in and take over a nursing home and run it on an emergency basis while you deal with the pandemic in it? We were talking about bringing in the National Guard, but they're not really suited for it. So the bill that we've got would address a variety of those problems, and we're going to be calling it up on the Senate floor next week and hope we can get unanimous consent to pass it. So more on that later.
Well, on that note, of course, there have been a lot of coverage of the disproportionate effect of COVID, not only among African Americans and Latinos in particular from a health demographic, but also in terms of being on the front lines of service industries like home health aides, home health care workers. You know, what is sort of a broader response when you think about people who just can't afford not to go to work, who are overexposed and may disproportionately be, you know, literally getting sick and dying from this? Where are we, or what's your thinking on how to address those particular concerns?
I think the broader response has to be a reset of what we view as essential and important. What is compensated very highly in our society and what this COVID pandemic has revealed to be essential end up being two very different things. And I'm a very, very big supporter of added payments for essential workers who are going into environments where there is risk. I think it has been cruel to the point of disgraceful that, for instance, meatpacking plants drive their employees to work by threatening to cut off their unemployment businesses, their unemployment benefits, and then don't provide a safe environment. Indeed, some have actually asked for permission to speed up the processing lines, which inevitably creates even more risk for those workers. So I think we really have to adjust our baseline of both respect, safety, and compensation for the people who are doing these jobs that turns out are a lot more essential than we thought. And I hope that that's the lasting legacy of all of this. I do want to single out our mayors in Central Falls and in Pawtucket, which have big Latino communities and have had big COVID exposure. They have done a really good job. Mayor Grebian in Pawtucket, Mayor Diosa in Central Falls have not only done a really good job individually, but they've also worked together to create joint programs for their constituents. And they've brought in a former state health director and really powered up the community health center support so that they are addressing this situation in a very local and a very real way, in a way that's very inspiring, and I think just an example for the country, really. And that's the kind of stuff that we need to support. And luckily, they've been able to get support from a variety of sources. But if in the next COVID bill, you see additional money for municipalities and for counties, not just for states, it'll be to help support instances and examples like that.
And piggybacking on that, of course, the intersection of health disparities in general, particularly in the African American community, and also our more recent tragedies of police shootings of African Americans. And when you think about the Black Lives Matter and the demonstrations and the movement, I mean, the tremendous amount of outpouring, both in sort of demonstrations and marching, but also just public conversation about these issues, you've already been addressing issues like mass incarceration, like recidivism, like giving alternatives to jail in legislation. Where do you see the intersection of these two events moving forward in terms of continuing on that path in terms of public policy?
You know, there are times, if you think of a seesaw, when it feels like you're walking uphill up the seesaw and you just have to keep plugging uphill. And then you get over the tipping point and suddenly it's a downhill path and things move faster and more readily and there's more support. And I think we've just had one of those tipping point moments. When you see essentially every major corporation coming out and having to make really strong statements about remedying social injustice, that's a pretty strong sign. When you see NASCAR say that they're not going to allow the Confederate flag anymore, I mean, my God, the Confederate flag was sort of the informal banner of NASCAR. So you see these big social moves taking place. And I think that's really, really valuable. And I think it's going to lead to continued progress, particularly in policing reform. I think there's a lot of great work that we can still do. I do want to say that for Rhode Island, the police departments and the minority community, their leaders have worked together for a long time. So while there is work to be done, very significant work ahead of us. We are starting in Rhode Island from a better place than many, many, many other jurisdictions, because community leaders like Jim Vincent and police leaders like Hugh Clements have been at these issues, starting with community policing and on community relations and racial profiling, and now working on the opioids epidemic in entirely unprecedented ways. We've got really terrific opportunities, really terrific police and community leaders. So we're actually really well positioned to take the next steps, and I'm excited for that.
I wanted to just, there's a lot of questions piling up, so I think I'm just going to ask you one last question about the two, given your background, of course, as U.S. Attorney and Attorney General of Rhode Island. Last week's Supreme Court rulings on workplace protections and also the Dreamers DACA program. Could you just comment briefly on what you think those mean moving forward, and then we'll open it up to the panel, the audience, for questions.
Yeah, I think the right wing of the Supreme Court is a little bit torn between trying to serve the interests of the Republican Party and the donors that brought them there, and also trying to stay relevant and kind of in the mainstream of corporate America and kind of middle of the road America. And I think in these cases, the DACA kids are about as an appealing group of kids as you could imagine. And they've been, valedictorians of their class, and they've gone and served in the military, and they've done, great things. And it sure wasn't their fault that they got brought to this country when they were 2 years old. So the idea of punishing them and sending them away is kind of preposterous. So I think it was an easy call for Roberts to break from the right wing on that one. And then with respect to the LGBTQ decision, wow, we've made such a move on that in the last 15 years that I think for Gorsuch and Roberts, again, that was an easy shift. The former decision, the DACA one, obviously irritated the extremist anti-immigrant fringe of the Republican Party. And the LGBT one obviously irritated the extremist fundamentalist fringe of the Republican Party. And it's a little bit sad that in one case 3, in the other case 4 of the Republican appointees still went with the fringe. But the center of the court held. And I think those are two very, very good decisions. I think it would have been foolhardy for the court to have picked those fights with society, with all the other troubles that they have within the court right now.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to open up for questions, but we are going to start with Professor Ernesto Zaldivar, who focuses on cybersecurity. So if we want to, there he is, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Schiller. Hi, Senator. Nice to see you again. The pandemic has caused several paradigm shifts. Among them, the government can no longer take for granted that government employees can safely work from their offices. The Senate is no exception. So I'm curious, what has the Senate done and what is it planning to do so that senators can continue to work with their staffs, share and access electronic data with their staffs when they're away from the office?
I'm not a technical expert on that. What I can tell you is that we have gone virtually entirely remote in my offices, both in Providence and here in Washington. And it took just a little bit of adjustment for my staff to get used to it, but it's been very, very successful. We have not yet seen any incident in which anybody has hacked into one of our meetings or one of our Zooms or anything like that and, done anything wrong or abusive. We have a Senate Sergeant at Arms who keeps an eye on the cybersecurity of our office operations. Obviously, we're not talking about anything classified. It's just private, office stuff. But 99% of what I do in the office, I wouldn't mind doing with a camera in the room, except that people would probably be bored with most of it. But there's very, very little of it that's, secret or, we'd be divulging to the Republicans our super secret strategy here. So the security concerns aren't all that great. I do think that as targeted private sector companies have to deal more and more with remote work, they are more at risk. If you think of the companies in Rhode Island that support the Naval Undersea Warfare Center, they've always been targets. They're going to continue to be targets. Some of them are fairly small. Even big companies like Raytheon, which are very expert at this, are targets. And clearly, some of our main rivals in Russia and in China are eager to steal the procedures and patents and processes that support our submarine fleet, our aircraft, our operations in space, and so forth. So I think, believe it or not, we're actually more boring in government, in our regular operations, and we're not really that high risk. And the private sector, particularly in the defense sector, is probably at the highest risk. The other place is obviously in the healthcare sector, biopharmaceutical and so forth. I'm sure the Chinese are eager to steal anything we're designing and building so that they can copy it and make it for themselves.
I'm also curious if the Senate has started to explore ways the pandemic might affect both conventional and electronic voting methods in the upcoming election.
Yeah, that's been a really big issue for us. We're obviously in touch with our secretaries of state a lot. Nellie Gorbea, I'm in touch with frequently on this subject to make sure that we have what she needs to keep our election safe. Rhode Island has been good so far. I think our systems work, and we really haven't had any election dysfunction, unlike Florida and places like that. But there are plenty of places where if you don't have a backup paper ballot and you get your system hacked in some way, or even if you don't get your system hacked in some way, but the hacker can leave enough of a cookie crumb trail to make it look like it might have been hacked, so that a political party or a political actor can then take advantage of that set of facts to create a scenario in which he or she was unfairly deprived of their election. You can build a whole lot of damage and a whole lot of dysfunction around something that isn't actually a successful hack. And in that sense, you're hacking our society and you're hacking our politics without necessarily having actually hacked into the cyber system for voting. And at the outer extreme, we get hacked all the time by people who put nonsense up on Facebook. And because Facebook isn't transparent about who's buying the ad, it could easily be some flunky oligarch of Vladimir Putin's who's paying for the advertisements. In the last election, they were so sloppy about this, they took payment in rubles for political advertisements. I mean, give me a break. And they're not much improved, let's put it that way. They're pathetic, in a word.
Well, on that, actually connecting to that note, in terms of public health safety and thinking forward, the election, and then of course in the next year, we have two related questions on vaccines. So one is, do you think the United States is in a position to work internationally on a vaccine? Is there coordination for global efforts on a vaccine, or is it just first past the post and people are competing with each other? And once it is developed, how might it be distributed? And the second thing is, do you think there's an appetite in the U.S. Congress to make the vaccine free to every American, should it be eventually developed and deemed as safe?
The latter question is easy, yes. A strong bipartisan, bicameral appetite, I would say. With respect to where we are in the world, I think unilaterally pulling out of the World Health Organization at the critical moment when it's going to be most important in distributing vaccines around the world and supporting research. It's a little bit like withdrawing from your rural volunteer fire department just as your house catches fire. So I don't think that was a very bright move. And the president delights in being provocative and offensive to our allies. So he's done a lot to reduce the goodwill for America in the world. And if some other country is the first one to come up with a vaccine, I think there will be a political drift against cooperating with America and getting us the vaccine as rapidly as would have been the case were he not engaged in this, what I consider to be international malpractice. So I think we may very well pay a price for all of it. That remains to be seen, however.
So in the instance that we don't have a vaccine, obviously at the moment at the ready, another question is, how do you as an elected official or representative balance the interest of saving thousands of lives, obviously, but also the economic damage and destruction you already talked about for people who are losing their life savings in their businesses that are going under? How do we ask our elected officials to make that trade? I mean, how do you even think about making that trade-off?
Yeah, well, it's obviously a lively conversation around the country, and different people have made different decisions. I suspect that the people who made bad decisions, the governors who made bad decisions in particular, the COVID virus doesn't really care what your politics are. It's going to behave the way it's going to behave. And if you get it wrong and the pandemic explodes in your state, you'll have to pay the consequences of that. And I think there'll be an adjustment made. It would be better if they went with the science in the first place, rather than wait for the science to be proved right, with a lot of deaths and a lot of sorrow in the public before you realize, oh yeah, the scientists were right all along. I think in Rhode Island, we did a good job. I think the governor did a very good job at finding that balance and being deadly serious about making sure that we limited the exposure, but also leaning in hard to reopening as best we can as we learn better and better how to reopen safely. But there are going to be people who suffer as a result of this economically, who are low risk, and they should not be overlooked.
And then you've been talking about how you think there probably will be support for continuing some of the benefits that have been coming from the federal government to support those people who've been hurt in their businesses.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think there's bipartisan talk in the Senate about another COVID bill. The majority leader has first said he feels no urgency, and the House bill is dead on arrival, and then he got around to saying, well, we should do something by August. So I suspect that we're back next week. We're out for 2 weeks after that at home. And I think when we get back, there'll be discussions in earnest about what we're calling COVID-4 looks like. And I hope that that extension will be in it, perhaps modified so it doesn't create the against work incentive, something big for states and for local communities, towns and counties.
Now,
Something for the workers who are going out there and taking chances in this environment. Those are the key things. And of course, making sure that our healthcare system doesn't collapse under this pressure.
and exactly to this point, we have another question. We talked about the elderly, we talked about Medicare, of course, in some ways, but Medicaid is also a big funder of the health insurance plan for the low income, a big funder of nursing home care, among others. So the question is there any appetite in Congress to raise reimbursement rates in Medicaid for some of these very same services that are being offered in nursing homes or home health care or other kinds of services offered by frontline workers?
That has not been part of the COVID conversation. The immediate concern that we've had, particularly for Rhode Island, with respect to Medicaid, has been that with respect to the next tranche of money going out to the provider community, it will be used basically to backstop the failure of the states that refused Medicaid expansion to do Medicaid expansion. And of course, that moves an enormous amount of money to states with Republican governors who dodged Medicaid expansion, and absorbs a lot of the pool of money that we would otherwise in Rhode Island and in other states that did the Medicaid expansion would share in. So we're concerned about a biased response like that, and we're just going to have to wait and see what they choose to do.
And then along the same lines of thinking about the sort of macro effects of COVID on the economy, what are your thoughts on the moratoriums that we've had on evictions, for example, at the local level in cities and states, but also on a sort of forgiveness for mortgage payments? In other words, that usually goes till September. What do you think happens in the fall for a lot of the people who are still going to need this kind of help?
Yeah, that's going to be a key. That's a key unknown. I think a lot will depend on what the status is of the pandemic at that time. If it looks like we've mostly got it behind us and it's down to tolerable levels as we are right now in Rhode Island, then I think you get one set of answers. If the explosions that we're seeing right now in Arizona, Florida, California, and other states continue, now you get into a very, very different set of concerns, because you really are back into the pits of trying to save lives and trying to keep hospital systems from collapsing. Those images of temporary morgues and of just overwhelmed hospitals in New York, I think, should haunt every American. And even if you're out in rural America and you don't like New York much, this could be you. So the image is still something that is profound.
In terms of actual public health and COVID, Rhode Island, I mean, under Governor Raimondo, has managed to test a huge percentage of the state population. And
Yeah,
I think a lot of people wonder, how she's paying for that. In other words, is it federal money that pays for that? And if so, would there be a time when everybody in America can get a COVID test for free?
I hope so. You probably would actually be in a situation which you don't need everybody to, but if you're testing enough people who are in the right places from an epidemiological point of view, you've done your job and the rest is not really necessary. So I think building that out has been important. The failure of the federal government to set those parameters and to create a strong and solid testing regime has been one of the worst failings of the administration. Setting the states against each other to fight in a kind of zero-sum game for protective equipment, for testing equipment, for the supplies that they need. All of that, I think, was a very unfortunate choice that created enormous cost and enormous discouragement and enormous, just, from an economic point of view, friction in the system. It was just very, very inefficient, and it burned up a lot of money of people going down dead ends and blind alleys. So that unfortunately has not been our finest hour, but nevertheless, we'll keep banging our way forward, and maybe things will change in a few months.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit off of this topic and go back to, of course, Black Lives Matter and policing and movements that have been calling for all sorts of things in terms of complete defunding of police to repurposing funds. So we have a question from somebody who's viewing this to say, well, Providence spends north of $80 million on policing, for example. How might that money be spent differently, or how might the federal government encourage localities to spend money differently in their efforts on policing and public safety?
Yeah, I think those are the models that we need to work with. Obviously, I can remember just in my own personal experience that when I was a young lawyer in the Attorney General's office, the police had essentially no presence in South Providence. The only time they turned up was in response to a 911 call or a raid that they were doing. And they basically always just went in with their sirens blaring and did what they needed to do and got back out. That changed with community policing. President Clinton's work on that changed it. And right now you see community police stations all over the community. So I think what you can see is you keep making those sorts of changes. The latest good change that we've seen out of our law enforcement community has been on opioids. For a long time, we treated somebody who was an addict as an offender, as a criminal, as somebody who needed law enforcement attention, criminal justice attention. Now we realize, wait a minute, these people actually probably need medical attention more than anything else. And so you have stories like Little West Warwick hired a peer recovery coach to ride in the cruisers and come in the morning and look at last night's scratch sheet of what had taken place and go out with a nice detective in plain clothes and just knock on doors and say, hey, this happened last night. We just want to make sure everybody's okay. There are all these treatment capabilities that are available. If you need us, here's a card. And literally starting to save lives as people begin to turn up and get treatment and get diverted away from prosecution and get the health care that they need at the emergency room, have the emergency room ready with its own peer recovery support, so you're not just being kicked back out onto the street when you're, through your episode. So I think we're seeing these changes take place, and we actually may need to spend a little bit more money in law enforcement to reach into these new roles in the same way we spent more money opening community police stations and supporting the community policing effort back in the Clinton era. So defund is the wrong way to look at it. Reboot, re-engage, improve. I like all those words.
And just to follow up very quickly on that, in terms of the transfer of military equipment, which seems to be a big issue, and it's unclear exactly how much of this actually happens from the federal government to localities, is that still something that is happening? Has that got a price tag on it that it could be diverted to other uses?
Because it's more or less given away by the federal government or transferred at a very steep discount, I don't think it's a very big part of municipal budgets. And there are only so many, radiation-proof underwater salvage vehicles that you can use. A lot of it is just military-style equipment. And I think once you've got an operating SWAT team so that you can actually handle the rare occasions when you really need that kind of equipment, to load up the police department with a lot more of it sends the wrong message about how you're supposed to engage with the community. So I think that program is going to end. The Booker-Harris legislation in the Senate would take it out or restrict it very dramatically, I should say. So I think that's not a big expenditure. I think that's more a signaling thing, but I do think it's an important signal to correct.
So shifting a little bit to your work on climate change, you've been a very strong advocate of paying attention to climate change. You've given hundreds of Senate floor speeches on this. So with the breakdown, it looks as though in international health organizations and cooperation across countries on infectious diseases and COVID-19, do you see any spillover to the efforts for climate change globally or the Green New Deal here? Do you think they're related at all? Do you think this will have any impact on those kinds of efforts moving forward?
I think that the pandemic experience has awoken people to the possibility that things could go much more badly wrong than they anticipated. Nobody 6 months ago would have projected that we'd have had to go through lockdown, that we'd have had to spend trillions of dollars to support the economy, that there'd be all this dislocation, upheaval, and suffering. So I think it adds a little bit to the reality of climate change. I call it opening the aperture of possibility. And the aperture of possibility opened not only in people realizing, wow, what could happen to my ordinary life actually could be much more significant than I considered, but also in government, our aperture of the possible has increased enormously. Who would have thought we could spend trillions of dollars like this in this rapid fashion, and that we need to, and that people would support and depend on it? So in that sense, I think it's highly relevant to climate. where you need to understand that massively disruptive changes are headed our way that we can almost not envision right now, and that we're going to have to do big things together to deal with that. And I think the aperture of the possible is open in both of those arenas, and that's to the good.
And along those lines, the idea of sort of the transferability of infectious diseases, we have a question about that. Do you see that the United States will learn from this at the federal level or at state levels and invest in a more systematic approach to handling infectious diseases?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're seeing this very unfortunate and misguided abuse of the public health system by people who don't like being told what they need to do to keep them and their neighbors safe, and who are feeling rather militant about their unhappiness. But I think that's a small segment of the population. I think most people realize that we did a lot better in this because we have public health infrastructure, and we would have done a lot better still had the public health infrastructure been engaged more effectively earlier and gotten more support from the political side. So I'm hoping that one of the lessons out of this is that we need to invest more in public health infrastructure, and we need to be prepared for these things. It's not always going to be a mass pandemic. It could be the equine encephalitis, the child who dies from equine encephalitis in a place that never had that experience before because the mosquitoes that carried it didn't get that far north before climate change. And for that family, that's as big a tragedy as if they'd lost that child to the pandemic. So whether it's a tragedy writ small or whether it's a tragedy writ large, the solution is a common one, which is trust the public health apparatus and make it strong enough to protect us.
And that word trust leads to the next sort of set of questions, which is do you view this as a moment in time or a sea change in terms of party polarization on some of these key issues? So if there's an opening on climate change, is there also an opening, let's say, on the idea of policing, the strict law enforcement that we have here, but also on spending money, the government doing good things versus being, criticized or demonized by people who are limited government advocates or don't want a big federal government? Most people are seeing we need the government right now. And so is that an opening politically, you think, for the Democrats to continue to make this case? Or will it also, at the same time, push some Republicans to acknowledge that there are some things you absolutely need the government to do? Do you see any of that kind of change happening as a result?
Yeah, I think some of that falls within that aperture of possibility idea that I mentioned. I think that one of the conditions that we've had in our society has been that an anti-science, anti-government ideology, which usually just inhabited the fringes of society, was discovered by big industries as a significant rhetorical vehicle to advance their interests. If you're a big polluting industry and you can convince people to be against the government agency that regulates you and to doubt the science that says that your pollution is dangerous, you've just won a big twofer victory. And so there's been this whole apparatus, mostly paid for by the fossil fuel industry, but not entirely, that has lifted up this fringe anti-science, anti-government theory and moved it mainstream into our government in a much more serious way. I hope that what we're living through with this pandemic puts an end to that anti-science, anti-government ideology. People see that it's not cute, it's not funny, it's not clever, it is harmful, it is dangerous, and when we need government to help us and when we need science to guide us, to ignore those is just self-abusive behavior, and it's really painful and dangerous. And so I hope that that maneuver happens. The other thing is that, a lot of the dysfunction in government comes from what I call dark money. When the Citizens United decision let unlimited amounts of money into politics, and the unlimited spenders immediately figured out how to hide that it was them who was doing the spending, so it all flows through these weird dark money channels through shell corporations and front groups and pops up in terrible advertisements with groups you've never heard of behind the ad. That whole phony apparatus didn't exist a decade ago. And it's a rotten, crooked apparatus in our country. And to the extent we can get rid of it, I think you'll see health return to the body politic again. Maybe not perfect health, but right now this is really a disease in the body politic. And the idea that big, dirty special interests should have that much control over our politics by being able to hide who they are when they spend unlimited amounts of money on threats and influence and cajoling and all of that, it's just rotten and it's wrong. And if we fix that, I think a lot gets better. So you get rid of the dark money, you discredit the anti-science, anti-government ideology, and suddenly we start to look like America again.
But on that note, that's another, we're about to finish up, but in the last minutes of this conversation, thinking about electoral security, we've had a couple of questions about that going into November, and going back to Professor Zaldivar's question about just cybersecurity. Two things. One is social media and the amount of money that's spent on social media that is absolutely hidden, and the sort of very small steps that Twitter and Facebook appear to be taking in terms of correcting false information. What is it that a consumer of those social media can do to try to figure out what's being distorted and what's true? And the second thing is, how comfortable are you with ballot security, particularly vote by mail, going into our November elections?
I think the danger to ballot security is less than the danger of voter suppression. The mail usually works pretty darn well. We've been doing mail ballots in Rhode Island for a long time. They work. There may be occasional fraudulent ballots filed, but it's mighty rare. Experience has shown that it's mighty rare. You've got states that have gone to full-on vote by mail like Oregon years ago, and they have managed to cope their way through it without any significant problems. So I think that that concern is rather illusory. I think the danger is much more in the public sphere of our public debate between ourselves as Americans be polluted, worst case, by foreign actors trying to degrade our society and degrade our confidence and degrade our democracy. And then to a slightly lesser degree, because it's domestic, big domestic special interests trying to exert their will in ways that run contrary to the American people, frustrate the American people about government, and are fundamentally corrupt. And both of those problems get cured when Facebook and Twitter and our election spending and all of that becomes transparent. So back to Facebook, who I love to pick on. In the last election, they were running political ads from groups that they had no idea who they were, and they were taking payment for those political ads in rubles. If that's not a sign that you're being used by a foreign actor, I don't know what is. So they got embarrassed by that. My colleague Al Franken really rampaged with Facebook in our hearing on that and had a lot of fun at the president and CEO's expense. And so they decided they were going to improve what they were doing by saying that you had to know who the buyer was. But they only go the first hop. They only ask who's the first nominal buyer. But what if it's a shell corporation? Who's behind the shell corporation? What if the shell corporation is funded by Donors Trust? Who's the donor through Donors Trust? As a private company, they could so easily say, we are not selling any ads unless we know who the real funder is. And whether you put 5 nesting Russian dolls of shell corporations between you and us or not, we don't care. We're just not going to sell to you until we know who you really are. And if you're an oligarch, we want to know it. If you're ExxonMobil, we want to know it. The public needs to know this. And the fact that they won't do that, I think is a public harm that they are doing.
But there's always a bit of a conflict, I think, for the Democratic Party on this a little bit, right? Because Silicon Valley has tended to contribute to some Democratic candidates because they tend to be socially liberal, for example, but they've spent millions and millions of dollars lobbying to prevent any regulation by the federal government of their practices. So do you think that's going to come to a head for Joe Biden or the ticket or the Democrats in 2020, or are they going to find some sort of middle ground where they can compromise on this?
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of issues that are coming together that are going to be difficult for these big platforms. I don't think that them pretending that as a platform they have no responsibility for anything that gets said on it, they're just providing a platform, that's already a dead notion. They're already trying to clean up some of the worst things. So it's really a question of degree. You go beyond child pornography and, you know, where do you end? And they're fighting with that right now. But the idea that they should not be liable for anything that they offer on their platform, I think is also a dead letter. And we're just going to have to work our way through that question as well. The question of security, of anonymity, and whether that's a force for good or for evil, that's still a very wide open conversation that needs to be worked through. And then they're going to have to continue to defend themselves. You know, there are people who think that Google is being unfair and political when you dial in climate change and it doesn't bring up phony fossil fuel funded climate denial. You know, there are people who believe in a ideology that is simply false, and it annoys them when they see that rejected by a fact-based platform. But we don't want Google to be in a situation in which they move away from fact-based to accommodate irate climate deniers. So there are all of these issues that we're going to have to face, and they're all very wide open, and the Biden administration is going to have to look at it very, very carefully. And there's no free pass for these companies in Congress.
So as we close, and given that a lot of our audience may or may not be students either at Brown or friends of students at Brown, and young people in general, thinking about all of the energy and activity amongst young people in the last couple of years on gun control, for example, the Me Too movement, certainly Black Lives Matter, on DACA, Dreamers, and people who are here who need documentation. When you think about all that energy for young people, what would you say to them in a time, I think, that is quite stressful for them? They are looking to engage, they're looking to make a difference. How might they make a difference in terms of these kinds of movements? What have you seen that works and what doesn't work? What would you sort of advise them to do?
I think in 4 letters, VOTE, vote. It's easy to emote. It's structural to vote. And one of the things that I'm alarmed by is the extent to which around all the activity that we've seen on Black Lives Matter and earlier on guns has been back to the cyber question, has been a very pronounced social media effort to say, you can't count on anybody, you can't trust anybody, whatever you do, don't vote. And I don't know who's behind that because, again, all of the funders are hidden and hide themselves. But I suspect that there's a malicious purpose to a campaign trying to get young people not to vote. And I think the more we can make people aware that that campaign is out there, that creates a sort of naturally rebellious spirit to say, oh, you don't think I should vote? Just for that, I'm going to vote. Look at what happened in Wisconsin. People knew that they were being discouraged from voting, so they went out and stood for 6 hours in line to make damn sure their vote was heard. And I think that's the attitude we need to take into this election. There is a huge voter suppression effort. Some of it is very open and very obvious. It's amazing that they're being so indiscreet about it. Some of it is hidden, worked through social media, and just tries to breed discouragement among the people who they fear will vote for the other party. So VOTE, and become very discriminating when you hear anything that tries to discourage you not to vote.
I think on that note, it can't be said any better than that. So we want to thank Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. We want to thank the Watson Institute, Senator and Professor Zaldivar for participating today, and all of you viewers. Been terrific questions, and we look forward to the next conversation.
Thank you. Good to be with everybody.